Joe Biden flip-flop, Bernie Sanders socialist stand at Walmart, and Donald Trump anti-gun president. All right now on this episode of The Uprising.
LibertyNation.com. They are the resistance, but we are the uprising. With Scott Cosenza.
I felt this thrill going up my leg.
There's not going to be a President Donald Trump.
A president! Can you believe it?
This is somebody who knows what's right and what's wrong.
You know what podcasts are, by the way? Talk shows for people who cannot make it in talk radio.
I just want to say to the men of this country, just shut up, do the right thing for a change.
I think possibly that's the most unattractive form in which prejudice can be met in this country, is the rage of the entitled.
Welcome back to The Uprising, a podcast of LibertyNation.com. I am your host, Scott D. Cosenza. Well, gun control, I think, was the biggest item in the news for me that it was a mixed bag. There was a great ruling out of Pennsylvania that you probably haven't heard about. Another thing from the states, Virginia is in crisis with a sort of emergency session of the legislature called in response to the Virginia Beach massacre. And Donald Trump himself seems dead set on being remembered as an anti-gun president. We'll get into that first, and then we will have Mr. Tim Donner joining us, immediate past co-host of The Uprising, to discuss Joe Biden's week, which was another interesting one for the immediate past vice president. And hopefully we'll have time to get into a little Bernie talk as well, who really gave it to the fine folks at Walmart for their insolent greed and avarice. But first we will talk guns. We've got a mixed bag of gun news from the states, and once again, Donald Trump, boy, if he didn't do it bad with bump stocks, he's about to make people think, what's the difference between him and President Hillary Clinton on guns? Shocking as that may be to hear, as we hear he's the tool of the NRA over and over again. Well, I can tell you this. This and a lot of other members of the NRA do not think that he's a good president on guns. And we wonder, where is this pro-gun president that Donald Trump was rumored to be? Things started off, so we had the Virginia Beach massacre last week. He is asked, quote, "The suspect in the Virginia Beach shooting used a silencer on his weapon. Do you believe that silencers should be restricted?" And here's the president.
I don't like them at all.
That was, "I don't like them at all." Now, that just started things. After he got to England, he went on the Piers Morgan show, and if you thought you were done with Piers since he got driven out of CNN for things like his relentless campaigning for gun control in the United States, among other things, here we go.
One thing you also did, I want to pay you credit for this, because when we spoke in Davos after the Las Vegas mass shooting, I brought up the issue of bump fire stock and why it was legal when it was used to convert legal weapons to illegal ones. And you did ban bump fire stock.
I ended it.
I don't think you got enough credit for that. There's just been another massacre in Virginia Beach where the shooter used a silencer. Yeah. What is your view of silencers? Would you like to see those banned?
Well, I'd like to think about it. I mean, nobody's talked about silencers very much. They did talk about the bump stock, and we had it banned, and we're looking at that. I'm going to, seriously look at it.
Well, let's certainly give Donald Trump all the credit that he wants for banning bump stocks. And let's recall what that is. So the bump stock is basically rifle stock modified with a sort of spring mechanism in order to sort of mimic full auto fire without actually requiring the person to purchase a full auto gun, because not only is it subject to that $200 tax stamp we talked about before, but any legal new ones were banned from being introduced into the stream of commerce in 1984. So the problem is that bump stocks were never very popular in the marketplace. It's a very niche item, and they were not used and are not used in crimes because they're just not a good way to shoot a gun. For the specific instance of Stephen Hatfill barricading himself in a Mandalay Bay hotel suite to fire down on a festival below him, maybe that was a good option for him. But they're not sort of conducive to gun violence in the way that we sort of need to protect ourselves with, because it's a spray and pray kind of a situation. Well, the other thing is they are possessed legally. When bump stock makers first came up with this idea, and this happens often with sort of novel gun accessories that may alter the way a gun is used, they'll get a letter from the ATF. And it's basically a letter that says, hey, we are looking to produce this thing. We want to make sure that it doesn't violate the law before we go ahead and market and sell and produce it. We want to be in compliance with the law. We want our customers to be able to be in compliance with the law. And they get that compliance letter. And in fact, they'll ship you with, if you buy one of these devices, you can't now, but they will ship an actual physical small print copy of that letter so that you could show a local cop or have for your own edification. Well, guess what? Doesn't matter if you have that letter. Doesn't matter if you owned a company that produced bump stocks or had thousands of them in inventory. Trump just made them illegal by changing the agency interpretation of what that device was and saying, instead of, hey, this was legal to possess, that it's illegal to possess. Now, whether or not that's legal or constitutional, I don't know. I know for sure that it's anti-gun. I know that it will yield no safety benefit to the public. It'll frustrate the legal owners of this product, previously legal owners, and it constitutes a taking in the neighborhood of hundreds of dollars per unit for the bump stock. So you get the credit, Mr. President. You did all that in violation of our at least our property rights, if not our Second Amendment rights, if that doesn't guarantee a bump stock. Now, let's move to silencers. How did the silencer make it an especially deadly mass shooting in Virginia Beach this past week? Well, let's listen to the Virginia Beach Chief of Police himself, James Cervera, on the issue of silencers.
And he obtained the guns legally as well, at least some of them. We know the shooter used a sound suppressor. What difference did that make? And do we need more restrictions on gun accessories like that?
The sound suppressor is just that. So someone in one end of the building would not have heard a gunshot going off as opposed to another end of the building. But again, this is a very large building. That might not have been an issue in this particular case. As far as, more legislation on gun issues, I'm a member of Major City Chiefs. We did publish something about a year and a half ago. I don't think most of that would have mattered in this particular case. We do have the Second Amendment. It is very stringent for our country. In this particular case, the weapons were obtained legally. Everything was done in a legal manner by this individual.
So the chief of police himself is telling you wouldn't have made a difference on silencers. This is part of the madness that we in the gun-owning community we work against. After every one of these things that happens, we see this flood of attempts to legislate our rights away. They stand on the graves of these massacre victims and put it to the gun rights community like, are you careless? You just war death mongers? But there is no safety benefit to banning suppressors or silencers. There's just none. This is the one case that they can even point to in dozens of years where this has occurred. They're super highly regulated pieces of equipment that cost a fortune, and nothing to Virginia's governor, who has called for and is convening a special section of the legislature just in response to this massacre, and basically they see an open window. Virginia is a state that's gone from red to purple, I guess, and on its way to blue in many ways, and they see a window where they can now shoehorn in a bunch of highly restrictive gun control. Here's Governor Northam, blackface himself.
Virginians have spoken and said it's time for us as legislators and as their governor to act. And I'm bringing the General Assembly back toward the latter part of June to take up common sense gun legislation. And
well, let me just stop it there and say this Virginian hasn't asked for that. And this Virginian's gun-owning friends are not after that. And also, I'm going to go ahead and pre-object and say they're not common sense reforms. Back to you, Governor.
So we're going to include things like universal background checks, which over 90% of the population approves of, a ban on assault weapons to include bump stocks and suppressors, or silencers as we call them.
None of which, had they been implemented prior to the Virginia Beach massacre, would have changed the outcome one iota. The man owned all his guns legally. They were .45 caliber pistols. They have never been included in any assault weapons ban ever proposed. He would have been able to get them. He would have been able to pass any background check. The universal basic check, whatever he says. Did I combine the universal basic income with universal background check? Doesn't matter. We know the shooter bought his guns new from federally licensed firearms dealers and passed the legally required and mandated background checks commensurate with those purchases. It seems like every year we get more and more of these firearms laws that take us away from a society where firearms are a common or accepted part of a person's life and culture, and yet we have more problems with violence. 75 years ago, a teenager could walk into a Sears and Roebuck and plop down their hard-earned allowance, farm money, whatever, and buy a .22 caliber rifle. No problem. No questions asked in most states. And so we know that access to firearms is not a crisis. It's people who are willing to go ahead and murder their fellow man. Who that's the crisis. That's what we have more of. The supply of guns seems to have an inverse relationship to the supply of school shooters. Well, back to the governor.
Given local authorities, regions, the authority to really look at their government buildings and decide whether they want to ban firearms from those, bringing back one gun a month used to be very successful in Virginia. Now we have just a market of guns that are bought in Virginia and taken up into the northern part of the states, especially New York. So these are common sense pieces of legislation. Virginians are asking for them, and Casey, they're intended to save lives, and that's what we need to do. We need to make our communities safer in Virginia.
Is it incumbent upon him for removing the rights of Virginians to demonstrate that actually will yield some safety benefit? Let's pull apart those 2 points. The one gun a month thing, it used to work for Virginia. Is there an example of a mass shooter or someone else who's purchased more than one gun a month and gone out and used that gun as some kind of massacre tool? No, this is just any kind of restriction they can get to frustrate gun owners. And you could ask yourself, why does a gun owner need one gun a month? Well, why do you need to publish 2 newspapers or 100,000 tweets in a year, whatever it may be, that is you exercising a right that government officials have no business examining outside of some actual criminal conduct you've engaged in? That's part of being a free person. As far as letting local towns and cities decide gun laws, they want to remove preemption is what it's called. And so what happens is the power to regulate these things comes from state power. And states oftentimes, Virginia does this, and Pennsylvania, which we'll be talking about in a second, which actually has some great gun news coming out of there, they offer or have preemption in the law, which is to say that any town, county, whatever in those states can't enact their own gun control laws or their own gun regulations. It's a statewide issue. As you might imagine, what would happen if every town and county in a given state could have their own gun laws, where you could be a felon in one county and perfectly legal in another? It just doesn't make sense and wouldn't be done in any other way or with respect to any other topic or regulatable item except for guns. And the reason why there is a carve out for guns for this exception is because they'll just do whatever they can to get them, is my perception. It may be quote unquote common sense to enact all these bans, but I can tell you what, it's not going to yield any safety benefit. There's no evidence to indicate that it will. It's just going to make a lot of people feel like they did something. Well, our rights are not yours to extinguish for the purpose of soothing your souls. And I'll tell you, if they ban if they ban silencers, there's another issue that hasn't been talked about, which is that going along with the highly regulated nature of silencers, here's how highly regulated they are. They're all registered with the ATF, meaning, people who don't know about guns sometimes think that guns are registered with some agency. Almost all guns, statistically speaking, in the United States are not registered with some state or federal agency. But the exact opposite is true with silencers. Statistically speaking, they all are registered with the ATF. So in terms of like house-to-house searches to confiscate these things, that could happen. Well, it wasn't all bad news. Like I said, in Pennsylvania, there's great news on the gun front. This came in the form of a new Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision that was released last week called Commonwealth v. Hicks. Now, this is just a fabulous case. It's hard to downplay how great this is. Gun owners in Pennsylvania have always had a rough time with so many of the police agencies in that state not respecting their rights. Philadelphia, the biggest city in Pennsylvania especially, has seen the gun permit unit was set up in violation of the law itself, the law being the Pennsylvania Uniform Firearms Act. And what happens is, if you can't call the cops on the cops, right? So if you call the state police and tell them that the Philadelphia police are violating your gun rights, well, they're not going to do anything about it. The state attorney general's office is not going to do anything about it. So basically, you have to either sue them and fund the lawsuit yourself, or if you can find a lawyer to do it for you on a contingency fee basis to sue them. The problem is, for a garden variety firearms civil rights violation case, there's not enough dough in it for it to be worth the attorney's time. So those cases often don't get pressed. Well, one of the more egregious parts of Pennsylvania law surrounding firearms owners has now been overturned with this case. And previously, the law in Pennsylvania was that if you were seen carrying a gun, the police could essentially stop and frisk you for no reason other than you were lawfully exercising your right to keep and bear arms. Pennsylvania is a state that offers a license to carry firearms, just like a driver's license. If you go and present the appropriate documentation, and it's not about training, it's just about proving who you are and that you're not a prohibited person from carrying a firearm. As long as you can prove that, then you're entitled to the issuance of that license. They're issued by the county sheriffs, except for, I think, in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Well, in any case, the Pennsylvania Superior Court ruled that police were warranted to stop and frisk people who were just exercising these rights. It's a fantastic case that seems to violate every notion of Fourth Amendment jurisprudence that I know, but nevertheless, that was the law in Pennsylvania until now. Finally, that court has reversed its ruling. It was the Commonwealth v. Robinson ruling, and articulated a vision for real respect for the Fourth Amendment rights of people in Pennsylvania and their constitutional rights guaranteed under the Pennsylvania Constitution. They also included a great sort of catch-all warning about trading safety for liberty. The court said, quote, "Notwithstanding the dangers posed by the few, we must remain wary of the diminution of the core liberties that define our republic, even when the curtailment of individual liberty appears to serve an interest as paramount as public safety." Well, thank you so much for the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision. Just to give you an idea of what they're up against, the prosecutors group in Pennsylvania, when they filed their brief, they said that not only was it the legal right of Pennsylvania police to investigate anybody who had a gun, but that they were duty-bound to seize and investigate the licensing status of every single individual carrying a gun in Pennsylvania that they knew of. So that is the same guidance as saying to a police officer, every single car you see on the street, you should pull that car over to see if the person driving it is licensed to drive a car, right? I mean, obviously, how do they know if you have a license if they don't go ahead and pull you over and see if you have a license? That's the identical argument they were using to justify basically ongoing harassment of people exercising their Second Amendment rights. So a banner case out of Pennsylvania. At least the courts seem to be respecting these rights. If only our elected leaders would similarly respect those rights. Well, it wasn't all blood and guts on Piers Morgan for Trump. I had to include this clip as a gift to you. Once again, Trump cannot get out of the shadow of the John McCain controversies. Here he is with Piers.
I knew Senator John McCain well. I liked him. I respected him. I quite enjoyed your battle with him when he was alive. You would give it to him, he'd give it to you, and it went on. It seems a little beneath you, if you don't mind me saying, that now he's dead, you're carrying on attacking him. Is it not time to let it go?
No, I don't attack him. People ask me, like you're asking me. I didn't bring his name up, you did.
Sure.
You brought his name up, John McCain. So I'm not attacking him at all. I don't think about him. I was not a fan.
Now, it's just so hilarious. It's like he can't get away from it. You know, he just wants to never have to think about this guy, look at him, or talk about him again. But it keeps following him around. Well, Joe Biden has something following him around as well, and it's the allegations of plagiarism. The campaign acknowledged that it lifted phrases without attribution from various nonprofit publications in its climate and education plan. So here's a report with me and Tim to discuss that and other items. Joining us once again on the Uprising, Joe Biden for President correspondent Tim Donner. Tim, I leave out your many, many, many other titles and honorifics because it's the most important one that I'm interested in, and that is the Joe Biden correspondent. This week, huge story on abortion, huge story on plagiarism. Set the table for us. Abortion first, please, if you would. What went on?
Well, first of all, being called the Biden for president correspondent implies that I'm actually an agent of the Biden campaign. I actually resemble that remark, Scott, but I'll try to overlook it.
You better take the fifth.
Yeah, I'm prepared to do that, counselor. The thing with Biden is that he had, let's talk about the Hyde Amendment, because the whole thing revolves around that. That was something that was passed in the 1970s, famously by Henry Hyde, influential congressman from Illinois. And what it did was prohibit the use of federal funds for abortion, so that while abortion was declared a constitutional right in Roe versus Wade in 1973, it also didn't mean that there was a right to federal funding for abortion.
Yeah, so that I think I can just poke in here and say what's important about that, or even more outsized than maybe just any standard piece of legislation, is it's sort of one of these overarching things where if anything brushes up against it, that then becomes a big issue, that it would breach the Hyde Amendment. That just forbids the use of taxpayer funds for elective abortions.
And I think the thing that people need to consider, that is an organization like Planned Parenthood, which performs more abortions than any other organization in the country, by not using federal funds for abortion, they can use it for other purposes and then sort of displace their fundraising efforts elsewhere. So in effect, there is federal funding for abortion, but that's an argument for another day. Anyway, Joe Biden supported the Hyde Amendment for years, right up to now. There was a clip of him talking to someone at a fundraising event where he said that he wanted to get rid of it. But then his campaign affirmed that he was still in support of the Hyde Amendment. And now apparently he's pulled back from that and said he's not in favor of the Hyde Amendment. So the political courage level is not terribly high.
Well, wait a second now. Let's not, Tim, I've read a story as recently as today which discussed that this was just an evolution of his thinking on the issue, and was not prompted by any sort of political calculation or machinations. As a matter of fact, they would argue that if Joe Biden wasn't a candidate for president, he still would have reached that decision, that his long-standing, career-long support of the Hyde Amendment was just to end naturally in the spring and summer of 2019. What do you say to those charges?
Well, look, for a guy who said that Vice President Mike Pence was a decent guy, and then after some left-wing activist tweeted something, Biden then immediately apologized for calling Pence a decent guy. I would expect about the level of political courage that he showed on the Hyde Amendment. So now he's taken it off the table as an issue at the expense of showing that he will say anything and do anything to soothe the savage beast, which is the resistance in the Democratic Party.
Let me ask you this. So I think certainly it was a wholly political calculation. Of course, if there's any kind for that person to make, like there's some moral, like, whatever. Anyway, it's ridiculous. So, granting that it's a naked political calculation, one thing that sort of made me say, about this is I know that Biden covets these sort of white suburban Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin type voters, and a lot of those are Catholics. And those Catholics, while they may sort of not want a reversal of Roe v. Wade, this may be just a bit of a bridge too far, just like I think partial birth abortion was for a lot of those folks. So what do you think about that? Is there a potential political pitfall here for him?
Well, I mean, the question that Joe Biden is probably, or at least should be asking himself every single day when he wakes up is, how far left do I have to go in order to win the nomination without ruining my chances in a general election? And I think abortion is one of those things where I think he felt he would have been a punching bag throughout the, 15 Democratic debates if he continued to hold to his position on the Hyde Amendment. So for the sake of political expedience, he says, let's just say I'm no longer in favor of it. And of course, a president doesn't have a whole lot to say about abortion, does he, Scott?
Well, I mean, realistically, of course not. No, he's got no. Well, unless they invent some extra legal way to do it, which is always possible, Tim. Let's not give them any ideas, right? I mean, that's the last thing we want to do.
God forbid.
All right, so you think he won't? All right, so there's two sort of very quick takeaways. Does he pay a significant political price for a flip-flop in the primary sort of challenge, or is that a win for him? And then in the general, what is this, a win or a loss for him? This change evolution on this issue?
I think that's an easy question. That's what they call a softball, Scott. I mean, it's an advantage for him in the Democratic primary because it takes it off the table as an issue, because he's now basically threw up his hands and said, okay, I'm against the Hyde Amendment. So it takes it off the table for him as an issue. But in the general election, I mean, he was against it before he was for it, before he was against it, right? It's the John Kerry thing, the flip-flop, the fact that, as you and I know, Scott, the man has absolutely no principles. He is a career politician who's interested in one thing and one thing only, which is seeking and maintaining power.
Well, let's not act like that's not a principle that motivates him, Tim. I think that's your great peril. Yeah, okay. to your great peril. You say
okay. I stand corrected. The higher principle.
It's actually outrageous that you would say that, really, given the facts.
But the abortion thing wasn't the big thing this week, Scott. I mean, that became secondary to the.
All right, let's report what the main Biden piece is. As follows. Go ahead.
Well, the P word, plagiarism. I mean, and few people are aware of this, but this is a history lesson for people who weren't aware that Joe Biden had already run for president 31 years ago. In 1988, as a matter of fact, it was 1987 because he never even made it to 88.
The good old days.
He was discovered to have blatantly plagiarized a speech by Neil Kinnock, the British Labour Party leader at the time. And I mean, not only did he plagiarize it, but it was obvious because the speech that he plagiarized was in a prominent political commercial in England for Neil Kinnock. Now, if you don't think that Biden just ripped off this speech word for word, we've got the exact speeches by Biden and by Neil Kinnock, and you can judge for yourself whether this is a guy who, by the way, I'll just set it up by saying too, Scott, that he was accused of plagiarizing in law school as well at my alma mater, Syracuse University. So, but the Kinnock thing was the big one, and you can roll the side-by-side comparison of Biden and Neil Kinnock.
Why is it that Joe Biden is the first in his family ever to go to a university? Why is it that my wife, who's sitting out there in the audience, is the first in her family to ever go to college?
Why am I the first Kinnock to be able to get to university? Why is Gladys the first woman in her family? Was it because they were weak? Those people who could work 8 hours underground and then come up and play football? Weak?
My ancestors who worked in the coal mines in northeast Pennsylvania and come up after 12 hours and play football for 4 hours?
Anybody really think that they didn't get what we had because they didn't have the talent or the strength or the endurance or the commitment? Of course not. It was because there was no platform upon which they could stand.
No, it's not because they weren't as smart. It's not because they didn't work as hard. It's because they didn't have a platform upon which to stand.
What a...
Well,
yeah.
I mean, Scott,
as a man who makes his way in the world by the use of words, to say that speech couldn't have been edited with a few word changes, do you know what I mean? Like, it's laziness too, Tim. It's not like, oh, well, if he changed the word platform into some other word. I mean, like, are you kidding me?
You brought up an interesting word, which is laziness, okay? And that's what happened this week in the latest instance of plagiarism, certainly not by Biden himself. He's not setting up the website. But, I mean, they're rolling out their climate change policy to try to be somewhat responsive to the radical ideas of, like, all the other candidates in the Democratic race. And the best they can do is to cut and paste pieces from other, left-wing environmental activists, resistance organizations, and not provide.
It's a global climate crisis, Tim.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say, Scott. It's too late on a Friday, and I've lost my mind, and I apologize to you and the listeners.
It's them that I'm worried about the most. Okay.
And I renounce everything that I've said previously on this particular podcast. Scott, let's put it this way. When Joe Biden entered this campaign, he knew there were two things he couldn't afford to do. One of them was to keep putting his hands on members of the opposite sex. And the other was to not plagiarize or have his campaign plagiarized. Now, look, we talked last week about how he put his hands on a 10-year-old and then made fun of the people that accused him of creeping them out by putting his hands on them. The several women, at least half a dozen, that came forward. So he revived that issue, but he's really revived the plagiarism issue. Now, look, he's not sitting there, doing this on his website. He didn't know probably doesn't know much about the computer. But the point is that it's lazy staff work. Like you said, laziness. It was lazy staff work. They just cut and pasted some ideas that they thought would soothe, the radical base and make them not go after him. And that's what you get.
Okay, what about this Todd Tapper Biden clip here?
Well, I mean,
is that Chuck Todd and Jake Tapper?
That's Chuck Todd and Jake Tapper. And this was such an amateur hour by the Biden campaign. I mean, it was such a JV move in a varsity field. You'll hear all of that stuff. That even his friends in the elite media, the Trump-hating media, people like Chuck Todd at NBC and Jake Tapper at CNN, who hate Trump with every fiber of their being and would like to see Biden or any other Democrat beat him, even they had to admit this was truly embarrassing. Roll it.
Joe Biden has his name on a public policy institute at the University of Pennsylvania. He's been preparing to run for president at least for the last 18 months, perhaps longer than that, in different ways. Why are they cutting and pasting climate change proposals at the last minute? Is this a sloppy campaign? Are they not up and running? What's going on?
This was obviously a junior varsity moment for this campaign in what should be very much the varsity level squad. It's embarrassing.
This is a pretty amateur mistake for the frontrunners campaign to make on a substantial policy rollout when they had to know, when Team Biden got together planning to announce his campaign, the one thing they cannot do is plagiarize.
Right. So they couldn't.
By the way, I appreciated the real genuine sense of urgency in Chuck Todd's voice as he went about it. This was a man who was not pleased with the news he was reporting.
No, I mean, he was acting like, hey, Joe, you got to straighten up your act. I mean,
how are we gonna get through this thing?
But I mean, it says a lot about Biden, doesn't it, Scott? That, I mean, here are the two things that he can't do. He can't put his hands on members of the opposite sex, and he can't plagiarize or allow his campaign to do it. You'd think that'd be the first things that would be brought up at the first campaign meeting. And here he's revived both of those issues. And I mean, it's truly embarrassing for this
Tim,
guy.
There's one thing I know, that when it comes to these important decisions, when he's in consultation with his doctor, Jill Biden, he's going to be able to pull out of it, and we're going to see more from him out there. Thank you so much for your report, Mr. Tim Donner, Joe Biden for President correspondent to The Uprising.
Thank you.
Well, the number 2 candidate for Democrat presidential nominee, Bernie Sanders, was busy as well this week, and he went to Walmart's stockholders meeting to basically shame them for being so rich while so many of their employees are so poor.
Walmart is the largest private employer in America and is owned by the Walton family, the wealthiest family in the United States, worth approximately $175 billion. And yet, despite the incredible wealth of its owner, Walmart pays many of its employees starvation wages, wages that are so low that many of these employees are forced to rely on government programs like food stamps, Medicaid, and public housing in order to survive.
I just want to oppose what he just said with every fiber of my being. This is the socialists' retort to capitalism. What I ask Bernie is, how many people on welfare and food stamps has he given a job to? Walmart is a leg up for these people. They're not pushing them down and requiring them to get food stamps. If you have the job skills, the intelligence, the training and ability to get a job that allows you to elevate you above what a Walmart wage can pay, well, then you should go ahead and achieve that. Work for it. But if you can't, how is it Walmart's problem that they're the only ones that are actually giving you a job? Where's Bernie giving these people jobs? He's a multimillionaire. Here's another thing. If you're really poor in this country, Walmart's one of your best friends. Where can you go to buy so many goods that you need, from food and clothing, the basics, at a dirt cheap level? Who's providing that to you? Can you go to Bernie Sanders' office or the Vermont Farm Store, where I'm sure he buys his fresh food and organic, local, and they name the cows before they milk them? Well, that's all well and good if you're rich enough to afford it. It's great. But what if you're not? And most Americans are not rich enough to afford it. They can't eat farm to table. They can't buy their clothes bespoke at whatever tailor Bernie goes to. That's not an option. Poor people are massively benefited by Walmart and their lower prices. You could take every dollar from the Walton family and every silencer in America off the street, and it's not going to change anything in terms of lives lost or income made. It will make us less free, though, and it will grant more power and control to those in Washington and to the police and to those who have guns when we're not allowed to have them. Do you want to be a subject or a citizen? Well, that's it for this episode of The Uprising. Thank you so much for joining us. Please visit LibertyNation.com 24/7, 365 for all your conservatarian news and analysis, and find us somewhere on some social media and give us a like, give us a comment, give us that share if you would, please. Thank you very much. Bye.